Okay, so what is a spiritual awakening? Well, I think the best way to really describe it is it's the process of letting go of who you think you are to discover who you really are. Now, who you think you are is what is known as the false self. But in saying false, this does not mean it's like evil or sinful or bad. It just means that it's not the truth. It's not who you really are. And who you really are is the true self, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for now, I want to start off talking about the false self. Another name for the false self is the ego, and I'm sure you've heard this term, the ego, used, and I know for a lot of people they use it to talk about someone who's like really prideful or boastful. But the way I'm going to be using it is in terms of the false self. It's not a sense of self, it's just a false sense of self. And so what happens is that when we grow up, we are influenced by all these different factors that create this sense of identity for us, and then we believe all these things about ourselves, and then eventually this mental construct is established and formulated, and this is the ego, and this is who we think we are. And then we live the rest of our lives according to this mental construct, and we think that this is who we are. Now, a lot of times what can happen is this mental construct can change over time, and so we can have different labels, different identifications with who we think we are. And before I get into too much about what the ego is, I don't want to speak too spiritually. I don't want to make this too complicated. So I'm just going to kind of give you I'm going to share my story about how I identified with all these different roles and labels and thoughts about myself throughout the years, and then what caused me to really let go of that. Because again, this false sense of self, all it is attachments and identifications with, I mean, the first and foremost, that one of the biggest egoic beliefs is that all you are is a body and a mind, and you're just this separate entity, this separate self, and that's all you are. And you're born, and then you live for however many years, and then you die, and that's it. But then there's these different things like I am my body image, I am what I do, I am this role or that role or this hobby or this profession. And then as we age, as we get older, like I was saying earlier, these different attachments and these different identifications with all these different roles kind of change depending on where we're at in life. And so for me, I grew up playing basketball. I loved basketball more than anything. And as a kid, I wasn't really that good at first. I actually played soccer for I started playing soccer when I was 3 or 4, and I played soccer till I was 6 or 7, and that was because my dad played soccer. My dad was a big soccer guy. He still is a big soccer guy, but he got me into soccer. But then eventually I was like, I want to try another sport, and I developed an interest for basketball. And when I started playing basketball, it really became my everything, and I wanted to get good at it. And I wasn't good at first because I was a soccer player, so I had to teach myself, but I was very disciplined and I was very determined to be a great basketball player. So I ended up spending countless hours practicing and shooting hoops and training and watching games on TV, and this really consumed me. But it paid off because after a few years of devoting my life to basketball, I got pretty good. And then I got a trainer, and he really helped me. And then I started playing, I guess this would have been maybe middle school. I wasn't playing for my school. I think I was playing for some city league or something like that. And then eventually I played in junior high for my school, and I played in high school. And I got pretty good, and that was because, again, I made basketball my life and I devoted a lot of time into training. But when I say basketball was my life, it literally was my life. It was my everything. It was who I was. It was my identity. And what happened was when I started to develop my skill and I got good, people started to know me as Logan, that really good point guard. After I would have like a really good game, different friends and family would come up to me. Even like some of the opponents and their families would come up to me and they would like acknowledge how great of a player I was. And this became something that really inflated my ego, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. And so when I'm speaking of ego and I'm speaking of this false sense of self, don't think of it as good or bad. It's the ego is something that we all have. It's something that we all develop. It's part of the journey. It's part of spiritual development. Everyone forms an ego, but there comes a time where we have to let go of the ego, and I'll get into that in a minute. But anyway, so I got to a point where I knew myself as Logan, who was this really good point guard. That's how everyone in my community knew me. That's how everyone in my school knew me. That's who I was. And it would give me a lot of pride and joy during the day, and especially when I was playing and I was doing well and I was having great games. It was awesome. But what I noticed was when I would go to bed at night, right before I was going to sleep, I would start to have fear and anxiety because I would start thinking about, what if something happened to me? What if I got hurt? Or what if I just couldn't play basketball anymore? And then I couldn't be a basketball player. I couldn't be this version of myself that I was identifying with. And that was really, really scary, especially for being a kid, because this was everything. This is who I was. And so I really started to ponder and think about that. Like, if I lose this, then I lose everything. And the deeper root in that was because I had attached myself and identified so much with Logan, this point guard. I am in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, if for some reason I can't play basketball anymore, if I lose this, then I lose myself. I lose a part of me. And that's why it became such a fearful thing. And basketball is not bad. Loving basketball is not bad. Making basketball your everything, or whatever sport it is. Like, again, don't think of it as good and bad. Like, it has nothing to do with that. But the reason it was egoic, the reason that it was something that eventually started to affect me negatively, was because I had completely attached my identity to that. And it became who I was. And one thing that you'll recognize in this life is that everything is passing. Everything externally. All objects, all circumstances, all events. Everything is moving, everything is passing. And so if we're going to identify with anything externally, whether it's an object, a role, a persona, a label, a category, and we think that's who we really are, which that's what the mind will do. The mind will trick us into thinking that that's who we really are, whatever our label is, or attachment or identification. But what happens is eventually that season of being whatever we think that we are is going to come to an end, because there's that old saying, this too shall pass. And so that's exactly what happened for me. There was a time where I stopped playing basketball, and as soon as I stopped playing basketball, within a few days or maybe a few weeks, for whatever reason I stopped playing, I knew that I had to find something immediately to attach myself to become identified with again, because I was losing the one thing that was giving me a sense of identity, a sense of who I was, or who I thought I was. And so then I found working out, lifting weights, and I got into that. And same thing, I wasn't good at it at first, but I gave my entire life to it, dedicated countless hours to training and nutrition. And this is when I was in high school. And eventually it became something I was good at, and I was getting bigger and stronger, and I wanted to be a bodybuilder, and I wanted to be a trainer. And the gym completely consumed my life, and it was amazing, but it was literally the same thing all over again, the same cycle. It's great. It's interesting how those cycles and patterns work in life. But again, I got to a place where I'm going to sleep at night, and during the day I'm fine, during the day I'm content, I have peace, I have joy, happiness. But as I'm going to sleep at night, I'm thinking, hey, this is great. Everyone at the gym knows me for being this jacked kid who's strong and who looks great. But what happens if I lose this? What happens if I get an injury? What happens if I hurt my back when I'm deadlifting tomorrow and I can't work out anymore? And, I had all these different scenarios, all these what ifs. And that, again, brought this fear and this insecurity and this anxiety. And eventually, just like the whole season of identifying as a basketball player, as an athlete, same thing happened with the working out. An injury did come, and an injury did set me back a few months, and I couldn't work out for, it was around 3 months. And in that span of 3 months, I lost really all my muscle, all my weight that I had put on, that it took me years to put on this size and this strength. I lost it in a few months. That's really what happens with working out and with bodybuilding in general. You can put all this time and energy and intention into building this physique, into putting on all this mass and gaining all this strength, and then in a second all that can really be taken away from you. So that was just the reality I was living with. But again, another attachment, another identification. As soon as that was taken away from me because of the injury I had, then guess what happened? I found another attachment, another identification, another label. And this time, and this is the best one yet, this time it was when, after I had this injury and I couldn't work out anymore and I lost all this size and strength, I went through a low point in my life because I was depressed. I was so sad about not being able to work out anymore, and I lost this sense of myself. This is who I was. I was this bodybuilder. I was trying to compete. I was trying to be a trainer. This was my life. Now I can't do any of it anymore. And in that valley, in that low point in my life, guess what happened? I found Jesus. I became born again. And I grew up Christian, and I was Catholic, and I've shared this in another video, but I grew up Catholic, and then my family left Catholicism, became Protestant, evangelical, and we just became kind of big into evangelical Christianity, and I went to a Christian school and all that, but I wasn't really too into it when I was in high school, although I've always been someone who has loved reading the Bible, and I used to like going to church and stuff like that. But now that I couldn't work out anymore and I hit this low point, I found Jesus really through like a YouTube video somebody had posted, and all of a sudden now I became this like on fire for God and reaching people and evangelizing and trying to win lost souls for the Lord and trying to heal people and all this kind of stuff. That became my new identity. So I became my new label was a super Christian, a true Christian, one that was really born again, one that was really saved, one that really loved God, a true follower of Christ who was going to save the world and do all these great things. And of course, I wanted to be a pastor. And again, another season of stepping into a new identification and I'm studying the Bible like as much as I can. I'm listening to all these sermons. I'm going to all these conferences, and just trying to be this new thing, which now it's pastor, now it's minister, evangelist, healer. And, I did that for a couple of years. And then that was really one of my last major egoic identities before I had my spiritual awakening. So a spiritual awakening is when you reach the point in your journey when you notice, this is where it starts, you notice first and foremost that throughout my life I've been needing to have some kind of attachment, some kind of identification externally with some role or some position or some status or some name for myself to where all these other people know me as this or as that with this title and this label. And what you notice is that it's not really you. It's never really been you. It's been these different phases that you've gone through, and you've created these mental constructs to where you even convince yourself that this is who you are. But it's not the real you. It's who you think you are. And like I was saying earlier, one of the first recognitions of this, and this didn't come first for me, this came later on, but one of the first recognitions is, or realizations, is that you are not this body and you are not the mind. You have a body and you have a mind, but it's not who you really are. And with identifying with the body, which is something that we just believe, we just grew up believing, we're kind of told this, we think that's the way it is. But so I remember reading something, and I think I learned this earlier, like when I was younger, and then I heard it again recently within the past year or two, and it really showed me, it really helped me understand the difference between the false self and the true self and what the ego is all about. But again, the ego will really try to get you to convince you that all you are is your body and your mind. The only problem with that is what I learned, what I read, was that the body consists of trillions of cells. And what these cells are doing constantly are dying off and then replacing themselves. And so our bodies are always changing. Our bodies are not this stagnant object. It's actually a process, and there's all kinds of things going on. But the bottom line is that all these cells are dying off and replacing themselves, and everything's changing, everything's moving. Nothing ever stays the same. And so the body that you had 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago is not the body that you have right now, today. So think about this. So if you look back in your life and you think about all these different phases that you went through, oh, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I started playing sports and I wanted to be an athlete, and then I got into college and I wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor, and then that didn't happen, and then I got this, and you went through all these different phases of needing an identification for your sense of self. So not only are these mental constructs changing, these different perceptions changing throughout the years with what you're identifying with psychologically through the mind, but your body, your physical body, has also been changing through the years. It's never stayed the same. And so really, the mind you had 10, 20, 30 years ago and the body that you had 10, 20, 30 years ago is a completely different body than what you have, and different mind than what you have right now. It's all changed. And when I discovered that, which I found it fascinating, I then realized this. Throughout these different phases, that these different mental constructs, these different egoic identifications that I've had throughout the years, and then apparently through the changes in my body, which, I mean, you don't even have to read or learn that. You look at your body now, and you look at your body years ago, and you know there's been a significant change. But what really got me was when I noticed that throughout these different changes, whether it was with my physical body or with my mind, with these mental constructs, there was a sense of this sense of who I really was, this pure essence. It was like this awareness that was almost witnessing me throughout the years. And it was ever present, so it's never changed. And so this deep sense of self, this deep sense of awareness that I have right now was the same deep sense of awareness that I had when I was a kid, when I was in junior high and in high school and in college and a few years ago, 5 years ago. It's always remained the same despite these different egoic identifications, despite all the different changes in the body. And that really fascinated me, because during my spiritual awakening, when I was starting to let go of these external identifications with these roles, and I started really pondering, well, what about, am I just this body and this mind, or am I beyond the mind? Am I a spirit? Do I have some kind of eternal existence, and this is just a temporary existence or a temporary experience that I'm having here on earth? Am I something beyond this human form? And what got me to really understand that and to really consider it was, again, this, and it's so hard to put into words, but it's this realization that who I really am. So think about it like this. When I was a basketball player, and then when I went from basketball to being a bodybuilder, working out, and then from that to this super Christian, born again, trying to save the world persona, ego, who was the one who was changing? Who was the one that was needing to, or who was the one behind all the different phases, all the different identifications? That's what I had to ask myself. Who was the one that was aware that I was trying to or needing to have some kind of identification with some kind of external egoic attachment or label? Who was the one that was aware of that? Who was the one that was thinking those thoughts as I was going to sleep at night? Who was aware of this problem that I was having of needing to be known as this person, this basketball player, or this bodybuilder, or this Christian? Who was the one that was aware of that consistently throughout the years? And that is your true self. And that is what a spiritual awakening is. It's realizing, it's becoming aware that you are beyond the body, beyond the mind, beyond any kind of external label, attachment, category. You are beyond what people tell you. You are beyond what you tell yourself. You are beyond anything the finite mind can come up with. You are a spiritual being having a temporary human experience, is in essence what a spiritual awakening is all about. And then once you wake up to that, once you realize that, and you start to live from your true self, which again is eternal, it is ever present, it's infinite, although it's experiencing this temporary finite existence here on earth. When you discover that, and then you begin to live from that true state of being, that's when the spiritual journey really begins to take on a whole new level. It's the second half of life, which is what Carl Jung talks about. There's the first half of life, which is like developing an ego and really believing that this is who you are, and having all these roles and having this status, and trying to win people's validation and approval and acceptance by putting on all this, by pretty much putting on a show with who you think you are. And then something happens, and this is what I want to talk about now. Something typically happens, and it's different for everyone, but you get tired of going through all the different roles, and you get tired of performing, you get tired of having to put on a show, you get tired of all the different egoic identities. And something happens where it basically brings you to a place. It's typically a low point, it's typically a valley, a season of challenge, where you just kind of give up. You stop trying to be someone you're not. And you realize that who you are, your true self, that essence, that pure essence, call it spirit, call it awareness, call it consciousness, call it whatever you want, that's behind all the different roles that you've been identifying with, is enough just as it is. It's perfectly loved, it's perfectly accepted, it's perfectly validated just as it is. and there's nothing that you need to do or get externally to become whole, because you already are whole, and you're infinite, which means that there's nothing that you can gain or add that would make who you really are better. You are perfect just the way you are. So this true self, and I'm not going to talk about it too much today. I'm going to make a whole nother video on what the true self is, and really go into depth as much as I can. But I'll just say this real briefly. Your true self is the part of you that is one with God. It is not just a being, it is being itself. So God is not a deity. God is not some mega being in the clouds. God is being. God is consciousness. God is awareness. God is, really, whatever term you want to use is it's up to you. But God is infinite. God is eternal, and God is something that we are not separate from. It's something that we are one with. So we are divine, we are spiritual, and we are eternal. And this true self is what Christians, some Christians, maybe mystical Christians, would say it's the self that is hidden with Christ in God, which is, I think, from Colossians. And then in the East, so in Zen Buddhism, they talk about your true self being the face that you had before your mother and father were born. So it's this, again, it's this eternal essence, this deep I amness, this deep awareness that is always aware of everything you experience, no matter how much your body changes, no matter how old you get, no matter how much your external circumstances in life change, no matter how many different personas and roles that you identify with, and all that stuff. There's this ever-present, the best word for it is simply awareness, that remains the same, that continues on after even the body dies, and that was aware before this particular body that you're experiencing, this finite temporary experience, came about. It's eternal. Eternal doesn't mean a time that starts and then goes forever and ever and ever. Eternal is outside of time altogether. Eternal is transcending time, beyond time. It's just this present moment, this eternal now, this ever-present awareness. So again, I'm going to get into the true self in another video, and really, I want to do a good job at explaining it from a very practical perspective. I don't want to get too spiritual or too complicated with it, because it's easy to do that with the true self. So if you're having trouble really understanding what I'm saying, or if it's not really resonating with you in this video about the true self, just wait a little bit, wait a few weeks, and hopefully I'll be able to put out another video where I can really describe it and explain it in simple terms. So this transition from who we think we are, the false self, to the true self can be one of the most challenging seasons of our lives. And the reason is because we spend our whole lives thinking that all we are is this separate self, this body, this mind, this label, this role, and we really end up believing this. And it becomes ingrained into our subconscious minds. And so when we begin to let go of that, and we begin to wake up to this reality of, hey, I am far beyond this. This is not who I am. I've been living according to this illusion, to this false sense of self. When that happens, it can be very confusing. You enter into the unknown. You enter into a season of suffering, of anger sometimes, and it can be a lot to process, because really everything you knew, all these things that you thought were absolute truths, are not. And the ego hates that, and it can be again, so many of the mystics, some of the saints, I think it was Saint John of the Cross who came up with this name for it, but he called it the dark night of the soul. So the dark night of the soul can happen either before, during, or after a spiritual awakening. But the dark night of the soul is the season that we go through during this moment and this process of really letting go of all the labels, all the attachments, all the categories, everything we've been identifying with that is not who we really are. Letting go of all that. And then going within, because you can't find your true self out there somewhere. You find it by going within. Going into the mystery, going into the unknown, and beginning to discover and realize this sense of who you really are, the true self. It again, it comes with a lot of just, you're going into a mystery, you're going into uncertainty, and the ego loves certainty. The ego loves knowing exactly the way things are and having it all figured out, and that's really one of the main reasons. The ego is attached to that, and that's one of the main reasons why it's such a difficult and trying time that comes with trials and tribulations, because you're having to let go of it all. And essentially it's like going through hell. And that's how many people have described it. That's how I would describe it. When I went through my spiritual awakening, it was hell. When I was growing up in Christian fundamentalism, I believed that hell was, or I was taught, I was indoctrinated to believe that hell was this place in the afterlife, this literal place where unbelievers went to be eternally tormented forever, which is bull. That's not true at all. That's a lie that religion has come up with for fear and control over the people, but it's not true at all. But that's what I was taught, that's what I believed, and so that's why I was really so adamant about trying to save everybody and get everyone to convert to my belief structure, because that's the thing. There's 40,000 different denominations, and they believe different things, and there's different ideas about how one gets saved. And so for me, I thought I had my salvation method. I thought it was the one and only salvation method, because what I was believing and what I was hearing from my spiritual leaders was that this is what God was telling them. And so, if someone says that, if someone said this is what God is telling me, this is the way it is, this is the correct interpretation of the Bible and what salvation really is, then you believe it, right? Because that's what God said. And I fell into that trap. And again, that's what I was trying to do. That's what almost every conversation I had, I was trying to get someone saved so that they wouldn't go to hell forever. But that was just another ego season. That was just another identification, another attachment to create this version of myself as this Christian, as this young minister, this pastor, whatever it was. Anyways, hell, yeah, so I believe that it was something that, a literal place that people went to who weren't saved, who weren't born again. But after going through this dark night of the soul, I realized that the only hell that exists is the suffering that we face here on this earth. It has nothing to do with this, place in the afterlife that is run by Satan, that's full of fire and stuff that you see on movies. No, hell is real, but it's something that is temporary, that people experience on this earth. And when you go through this dark night of the soul, that's really exactly what it is. It is hell. And Richard Rohr said something. He said, religion is lived by people who are afraid of hell. Spirituality is lived by people who have been through hell. And when I read that last year, that really resonated with me, because it just really described and explained what I had been through, and how after going through that dark night of the soul, going through hell, letting go of all the egoic attachments and discovering this sense of who I really was, my true self, it was hell. But after I went through it, I realized, hey, this religious version of hell that I was taught, that I was told I had to believe, and if I didn't believe in it, I was going there, That's not true. That's bull. That's something that's made up. That's not a reality. The only hell that there is the suffering and the hell that we go through on this earth. Not something that's in the future or after we die, and it's certainly not eternal. That's ridiculous to think that. Anyways, so most of the suffering that we experience during this dark night of the soul, it's not punishment from God. It is something that is, it's part of the transformation. And so we come out of the dark night of the soul transformed. We come out with this realization, and we come out with a brand new perspective on ourselves, on others, and the world around us. And there's not just one dark night of the soul that we go through. There's really many that we experience. I've experienced a few. But there tends to be one main one and one big one that happens from the initial letting go of who you think you are to discovering who you really are. So that initial spiritual awakening tends to be the biggest, but it doesn't have to be. It's different for everyone. For me, it was the biggest one I've ever had, and it lasted for about a year. That's another thing. The time can vary for each person. So after I went through this, and after I was transformed, here's the thing about pain, here's the thing about suffering, and I think Richard Rohr said this too. We will either be transformed by our pain, or we will transmit it. And during this dark night of the soul, when you are realizing that everything you believe to be true about yourself is false, which is really hard, by the way. I mean, that's like the most important belief that you can have is what you believe about yourself. And so again, I know I keep saying this, but to really let go of all of that, all of it is devastating. It's very challenging, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that's what the second half of life is all about. And it's so much better. It's beyond anything you could think or imagine when you begin to live from who you really are. But this is what it's not. Spiritual awakening, this whole process of discovering and realizing your true self, is not about obtaining something. It's not about earning. It's not about achieving. It's not about getting something. Because your true self has always been true. It's always been within you. It's always been the essence of who you were, and it's never changed. We fall into this egoic illusion, and we go through these seasons, and we go through this time period of thinking that we are something that we're not. But the truth of the truth of our being, the true self has always been true. And so it's letting go. It's letting go of who you think you are, because in letting go of all these roles, identities, and attachments and labels, you are letting go of the things that are preventing you, that are hindering you from experiencing what has always been true, what you've always had. And so that's how a spiritual awakening works. Some people think that it's something that I have to do, like it's some spiritual practice, like the more I meditate, the more I pray, the more I go to church, the more I read my Bible or whatever holy book that you're reading. It's like the more I do something, then I'm going to be transformed, in the sense of then I'm going to earn or attain this new spiritual status or this new spiritual identity. And that is not how it works at all. It is the complete opposite of that. It is letting go. It is recognizing all the attachments, all the things that the mind has been clinging to in order to have a sense of identity, and then it's taking just a step back and realizing, hey, wait a second, I am not any of those things. I am what's aware of those things. I am not my thoughts. I am what's aware of my thoughts. And it's a lot like remembering. That is really what that's what the spiritual journey is all about. That's what a spiritual awakening is all about. You're not even learning something new that you've never known before. And that's why many people have said that during a spiritual awakening, when they let go of the false self and they start experiencing the true self, it feels like returning home. It feels like something that, and it's so hard to explain because it's beyond the finite mind. It's not an intellectual knowing, it's an experiential knowing. And what they say, and I would say the same thing. I would confirm this through my experience, through my spiritual awakening. But when you start to live from the true self, it feels like something that you've always known. And it's intuitive. It's from the heart. It's a heart knowing. And so remembering, or recognition is a great word for it, because recognition, the word recognition simply means to know again. And so if your true self is eternal, and it's always been true, and it's outside of time, and it existed before this temporary, finite human experience that you're having, with all the egoic identities that you've experienced, that means that if you go within and you go deep enough into your soul, then you're going to realize that this is nothing new. This is who I've always been. And there's probably even been times while you were so consumed in the ego and living from this false sense of self, you could probably even look back and realize the moments or these glimpses that you experienced of your true self that were really brief, that were really short, but there's always been the true self throughout the years, throughout time, even when you were really strongly identifying with a particular role or label or attachment. There was a movie, I guess it was maybe filmed in the 90s with Robin Williams. And so Robin Williams plays Peter Pan, and he starts out as Peter Pan. Maybe that's not how the movie starts out. The movie starts out with him grown up. Peter Pan has grown up and he's living in the world, and I think he's a lawyer or something, but he's got a family and he's caught up in the stresses of life, and he's busy and he's got all this stuff going on, and he totally forgot that he was Peter Pan. And so eventually in the movie he gets brought back to Neverland, and when he goes back to Neverland, he still thinks that he is who he thinks he is. He doesn't remember that he's Peter Pan. And everyone's telling him that he's Peter Pan, and he doesn't remember, he doesn't know. He's still living from this egoic identity of, I'm a lawyer, I'm a businessman, or whatever he was. I'm an adult. And so as the movie goes on, eventually he wakes up. He remembers, he realizes his true self, his true nature, and then he starts to live from that. And when he starts to live from that, then everything changes around him. And one of the biggest realizations in a spiritual awakening is you realize that your outer world is just a reflection of your inner world. And that's exactly what happens for Peter Pan in this movie. Things he couldn't see, he can now see. Things he couldn't perceive, he can now perceive. And there's literally a shift in his external reality, as within, so without. And then he lives from this identity, from his true self, and he's able to access his powers and his divine nature, so to speak, and that's the movie. And I grew up watching that movie a lot as a kid, but then I watched it after my spiritual awakening, and it really resonated with me, because it reminded me of just exactly what a spiritual awakening is all about. It's about remembering. It's about returning home. It's not about becoming something you're not. It's not about earning some kind of super spiritual status or identity or label or title or... No, it's who you've always been. There was just things that were preventing you, that were hindering you from experiencing that. So that's really the beauty of waking up to that. It's simple. It's not something that you have to get. It's something that you've always had. And people complicate it. People will add all these different criteria or these different rules and different things that must be done in order for you to attain it, and that's just another form of the ego. That's just another egoic thing that is being formulated by the mind in order to distract or prevent you from this ever-present awareness that always was and always is and will always be. I think that's it for today, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you just feel like sharing your story about what the spiritual awakening was like for you, please leave that in the comment section below. I'd love to hear it, and I'd love to answer any questions or comments that you have as well. So that's it. I'll see you next time.